Welcome again to Mideast Realities. We're talking with FAWAZ Turki, noted Palestinian writer and author in the English language, probably one of the handful of best-known Palestinian writers and authors. And at the moment, you're suggesting that everything we're living through is extremely transient and that this struggle between Israel and the Palestinians is going to continue in a new form soon.
It will continue in a new form. It will continue to be a struggle so long as there exists a dichotomy, let alone a plus-minus dichotomy, between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or the rights of the Palestinians and the rights of the Israelis.
But see, to the outsider like myself, an outsider who's been there 100 times and who knows people very intimately over there, the Israelis seem so dominant, and the client regimes in Amman, in Riyadh, in Cairo for that matter, seem so entrenched. They have so much money, so much power, so much authority. It looks to me like the goal of stabilizing the status quo with client regimes and with a Palestinian client regime, leaving Israeli as the dominant regional player and America as the superpower that controls the region. It looks to me like a fairly lasting arrangement. Are you suggesting that what I see is not the reality?
It was only like 2 or 3 years ago when we thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire that was going to be around for centuries to come.
Yeah, I can remember the Shah of Iran running the...
I was just about to say the Shah of Iran had the mightiest military power this side of NATO. And where is he now? 10 feet underground.
Right. Do you really think conditions in that part of the world are far less stable than they're usually portrayed as?
Unquestionably, yes. It's so long, I repeat what I said earlier, so long as this dichotomy exists between Palestinians and Israelis, occupier, occupied, colonizer, colonized, victimizer, victimized, we are going to have the dynamic of struggle involved here.
But you know, in the 60s and 70s, that dynamic resulted in quote-unquote terrorism. Terrorism put the political issue, put the Palestinian issue on the political map. It was airplanes being blown up and people in Germany at athletic events being killed. That's what put the Palestinian cause on the map, not intellectuals, not writers, not people appealing for justice and conscience. What is going to put it back on the map?
So you're saying the sword is mightier than the pen, huh?
I'm afraid so.
You
And
you
and I use...
You're talking to a writer.
Well, hey, me too. On the other hand, we got to face reality. This is Mideast Realities, huh?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, to predict history is arrogant and self-aggrandizing.
Yeah, but come on, that's what we're here to do.
I can't tell you precisely what kind of form the future struggle is going to take, nor can I tell you what kind of dynamic will be involved. But so long as the terminus of Palestinian rights has been defined as a little agreement giving 1/5 the Palestinian people,
1/20th of the land.
1/20th of the land,
and 1/10 of their rights.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Then clearly we have a prescription for the continuation of conflict in Palestine, in the Holy Land.
Let's go back to Palestine. You spent a number of weeks or months there. You
I
wrote
spent
this book.
5 weeks. About
His book is Exile's Return, which is available at your local bookstore. What are the inner dynamics of the society? I mentioned Hamas before, and you didn't say a word about it. I mean, when I've visited, I have found a lot of support for Hamas, a lot of support for opposition to the PLO.
Oh, yeah. Look, PLO's gone. PLO's finished. I mean, it has hardly any support in the West Bank and definitely in exile.
But it's got all the money and all the guns.
It's got all the money, and it's got the support as a client regime. It's got the support of the EEC, the United States, and so on and so forth. No, I do see Islamic activism, not just in Palestine, but the entire Arab world, as the new wave.
Even though you yourself, of course, exist on the existential opposite side.
I'm a secular Palestinian.
Exactly.
I mean, But I see political Islam. I see Islamic activists in the future being at the peak in the power profile of the Arab world as something inevitable.
Well, what about the details of what's happening in Palestine? Are you suggesting that the Hamas movement, for instance, is going to push out, or the Arafat henchmen, as you call them?
I see that happening potentially. I mean, that is contingent on a number of factors. If the henchmen manage to create jobs, to get the Israelis to give them more territory in the West Bank and Gaza,
To police.
to create, to establish conditions in the West Bank and Gaza that are concretely to the betterment of the Palestinian population, I think Hamas would probably will find it difficult to advance and so on. It is a major power.
But that's precisely what's going to happen for us. You just said the people have been beaten under. There is no life, there is no spirit. So of course these millions of dollars that are being pledged, and which the PLO that you now say doesn't exist is going to distribute, of course things are going to get better. They couldn't get worse.
No, they're not going to get better at all.
They're not going to get better.
I'm not an economist, but the West Bank, assuming in the unlikely event that it becomes independent, that the Israelis manage to surrender that territory to the Palestinians.
Well, neither of us assume that.
We not assume that. But even in the unlikely event,
even if it went that far,
that this were to happen, I don't believe that the West Bank is capable of an economic takeoff before 30 years or 40 years.
And Gaza?
And Gaza is even worse than the West Bank. When I say the West Bank, I really mean also Gaza.
Right.
You know, so clearly, the ideal situation that a lot of people would like to see happen in the West Bank is not going to happen.
But it's not the first time a people have been forced onto reservations, not the first time they've been put into slums, not the first time a people have been disenfranchised. If they're policed, and my God, Washington, D.C. is a very violent place. There are plenty of parts of town that you and I can't go tonight. If they're policed and out of the Israeli hair, who's going to give a damn about the Palestinians?
The Palestinians are going to give a damn about the Palestinians. Keep in mind that the Israelis, with all their military might, were not able to control the Palestinians. The Intifada, of course, is evidence of that. Then I doubt that a few dozen henchmen in the West Bank, loyal to Arafat and the ex-former PLO, will be able to control the Palestinians. I don't believe that a politicized people like the Palestinians will eat humble pie for an indefinite period of time. There will come a juncture where they will formalize their discontent and act upon it. You see?
You don't want to predict quite how the struggle is going to continue, but you're definitely trying to insist with me that the struggle will come back in a different form, that the current moment will fade, the current optimism will fade, and something new and different is coming forward.
I'm convinced of that. I will bet the family jewelry on that.
And can you put this in the context of North Africa and the Gulf? I mean, in a sense, what's happening in Palestine is derivative of what has happened in the Arab world. There's no oil. There was a little terror. And there were a lot of people concerned about this issue.
Yeah.
Still some. But can you put this in the last moments that we have in the context of what's happened in Algeria, what's happening in Egypt, where lawyers are being arrested on the streets as we speak, practically?
Sure. Yes, I will try to do that. You see, something very dramatic happened in the Arab world that seems to have passed largely unnoticed by commentators and political analysts. And that is, after the 1967 war, the Arab people felt betrayed by all the secular ideologies that they had put all their trust in. Baathism, Nasserism, Pan-Arabism, Bolshevik-style communism and stuff like that.
Betrayed because they were so weak.
Betrayed because here were the armies defeated in 6 hours. Actually, they say 6 days, but the Arab armies were defeated in 6 hours. This was something that they could not, their internal psychic economy could not really tolerate. This incredible defeat, the sense of humiliation, above all the sense of shame. Keep in mind, Arab culture is a shame culture, you know. And the alienation that the Arab masses felt at that juncture in the historical experience, namely all these secular ideologies that we had believed in and believed in massively, had really failed us. That's when they began to look around in this vacuum, you know, that occurred in the soul of their history, so to speak, to look for an alternative kind of ideology. What better ideology to embrace than Islam? They had tried...
It's like Americans embracing Christianity.
If you wish to...
which a lot of Americans do.
If you wish to use that as an analogy.
Well, but we have to put it in a context where...
So since 1967, there's been this progressive increase in Islamic activism. Not fundamentalism, by the way. This is the wrong term to use when you speak about Islam. There is no such thing as Islamic fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a function of the evolution of Christianity, not Islam. Ask any Muslim theoretician, an activist, he will say, you're either a Muslim or you're not a Muslim. You can't be a Muslim fundamentalist. Because there are no Muslim liberals. You can't have, you know.
So anyway, you trace this back to 67 and that defeat. And then... the phenomena of the emergence of Islamic activism in the Arab world came about as a consequence of that event, that cataclysmic event in 1967. And ever since that time, we've seen a gradual increase in the power of these movements. There are many Islamic movements in the Arab world, by the way. This is not a monolithic or homogeneous Islamic movement. Shouldn't we add the term nationalist also? Islamic nationalist movements?
I would submit to you that to become an Islamic activist, you have to be a nationalist. Because Islam is very political in its orientation.
But I mean, there's an alienation from the Western-imposed regimes, from the Western-imposed culture, from the Western-imposed policies, which then translates into a form of Islamic nationalism.
Yes, indeed, indeed. This is the case of a people and movements and theoreticians and ideologues who have taken Islam and looked in it for an interpretation of the social, political, and historical malaise. And Islam is rich with these visions of the role of men and women in society, you know, and how they should deal with their political situation in the global dialogue of culture.
All right. Now, how does Palestine fit into this larger context?
Because Palestine has always been not only part of the political discourse in the Arab world, but in fact at the very epicenter of it.
After all, that's where the 67 war was fought.
That's pretty much what, in fact, what it was all about. So Palestine could not actually not be part of this discourse, this political situation that we have seen emerge since 1967.
Is it too simple-minded, or can one almost sum this up by saying that the client regimes and their Western sponsors are lining up on one side, and the Islamic nationalists are lining up on the other side, and that those are the two forces that are really in political conflict?
No, that's not simple-minded at all. Not at all. I think this pretty much sums it up. We do see two dialectically opposed forces in their aspirations and their visions of what's happening in social reality, in confrontation with each other, in fierce confrontation with each other. Yes, indeed. On the one hand, we have the regimes who are protective of their power and wealth and prestige in our part of the world, whose survival is backed and underwritten by the United States, on the one hand.
Which is what the Gulf War was all about.
Was all about. And on the other, we have the Islamic forces in their diversity, in their different interpretations of the Quran, representing the mass sentiment, representing the alienation and the degradation and the poverty and the destitution of the overwhelming majority of the population in the Arab world, including Palestine.
We're talking with FAWAZ Turkey. This is Mideast Realities. And I guess what I hear you saying is that you don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. You don't want to predict where this is going to end up, but you see these forces, these huge political forces in a conflict where only one of them in the end can win. Either the client regimes have to go or the Islamic fundamentalists have to go.
Yeah, about prediction. Now, I don't think anyone can, I don't think a commentator can really predict the emergence of certain events. What we can predict is the emergence of a dynamic. And then knowing the kind of dynamic that clearly is before us, we can only speculate about what this dynamic is going to lead us to, finally. Yes, indeed, I see this confrontation right before us now. It's happening in the Arab world, these two fiercely opposed forces in confrontation with each other. And frankly, the United States and other Western European societies or forces will do their very best to ensure the continued survival of their client regimes in our part of the world, because that's
where the oil, the cheap oil and the petrodollars comes from.
Yeah.
And the Boeing contracts and AT&T contracts.
But on the other hand, keep in mind that we see this incredible phenomena that potentially, if not actually, has an incredible future. Not only because it is Islamic and it brings with it the disinherited and the destitute and the committed and so on, but also because it can draw on the resources of other Muslims in other parts of the world. There are Muslims in places like Tajikistan. There are Muslims in places like Pakistan.
Well, there are
Iran.
client regimes in places like Pakistan too.
But I understand. What I'm saying is, will this Islamic movement act as a magnet to attract in its orbit of power other equally disenchanted Islamic activists in other parts of the world? There are 1 billion Muslims in the world. There are disparate Islamic movements in virtually all of them at the moment, you know? Only in 2 regimes in the world do we have Islamic activists in power, Iran and Sudan, you know?
Right.
And the point here, will these billion Muslims finally find a way to unite? Not necessarily unite in terms of geography or in terms of territory or in terms of political unity or whatever, but unite as one people who have one ideology, to be able to draw on each other's resources to help each other. So I will not, in the end, dismiss the actual or the potential ability of the Islamic activists in the Arab world to achieve their goals.
All right, we're running out of time, so a final topic. You, Palestinian American, your book, Exiles Return, what does it mean to you? You're caught kind of in a vortex here. On the one hand, you're a part of the American political system. You live here, you relate to conditions here, you call yourself Palestinian American. Yet America is the very country which supports the client regimes and the oppression of the people that you were born into.
Yeah.
What does this mean to you?
Well, very simply, keep in mind that there is a country with an American population, and there's a government with officials who have imperial interests around the world. So I do not equate the two. I don't think that the average Joe Blow in Lawrence, Kansas, or Columbia, Missouri, or Hicksville, Ohio, is not sympathetic to the rights of the Palestinian people for statehood and independence. However, I do see that American officials in the American government, with imperial interests and designs on our part of the world, have a different agenda. So for me, to be Palestinian and to be American is not something that is mutually exclusive. I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive here.
I have a feeling, however, you don't vote for the Republicans or the Democrats.
Maybe
I'm wrong.
I think of them as twiddly-dum and twiddly-dee, frankly. But given the choice between the two, I invariably opt for the Democrats, because otherwise my voice would be wasted. Until such time as we have an alternative party with an alternative order, with an alternative agenda, if you wish, I will continue to vote Democrat.
So, but I hear you also saying that to a certain extent we Americans don't really live in a real democracy. We kind of have a client regime too. It's sort of the corporate state, the parties that are supported by very special interests, by big money, big corporations, military-industrial complex, as Ike would say.
Yeah, we do that. I mean, this is the lingo that I used to use in the 60s. I mean, I'm from that generation, and clearly I used to rail against the military-industrial complex.
So did Bill Clinton.
I was outside the White House calling American presidents all manner of names, you know, Johnson and Nixon and so on and so forth. And of course we railed against injustice. We railed against bourgeois smugness. We railed against the way that minorities in this country were treated, African Americans and so on and so forth. Yes, I mean, what can I say? Indeed, I come from that generation, and I still bring with me a residue of that idealism, more than a residue, actually. It transformed, maybe matured, kind of a vision of these ideals. Yes, that is so. But I live in America. I live with the people with whom my milieu of friends in America are people with whom I share a commonality of values, of lifestyle, of vision, of view of the world. And this is about. This is not a perfect democracy, but it's about as democratic as I can imagine.
And as you outline in your book, you've, because of your own personal experiences, you don't identify with Palestinian society and with the backward conditions and the theological conditions that are prevalent there.
Yeah, you see, I left my part of the world when I was a teenager. I grew up, well, I went to England initially, I went to Australia, I was a hippie in India for a couple of years, lived in Paris for 3.5 years, in the Latin Quarter. I wrote my first book over there, and I've been in the States for 21 years. So clearly, for me to say I'm a typical Palestinian would be wrong. Now, the reason I don't identify with the patriarchal norms of Palestinian culture is partly because of that, and partly because I'm a Palestinian Democrat who would like to see a transformation of Palestinian culture, a transition from patriarchy or backwardness to a posture of modernity of some kind. We still have an educational system, a family system in our patriarchal culture that is creating a process of socialization that is producing an individual whose constitution of personality is bent more toward the ethics of fear. You know, fear of authority figures, fear of innovation, fear of originality, fear of forming a counterculture or an adversarial current in society.
Fear of being struck down.
Fear of life itself.
Yes.
So it's a pity that any human being should be socialized to adopt this kind of posture in life. To have this kind of constitution and personality. Frankly, unless and until such time as we bring about a dramatic transformation in the very foundation of our patriarchal culture, we will continue to be defeated by the Israelis, by American imperial designs on our part of the world, unless we wrest control of our name and our identity. We will continue to be treated like a nameless, faceless group of third world people with no, as a lower species of men and women around the world, you know, which is the way that the British and other colonial overlords treated us in those days.
We've been speaking with FAWAZ Turki, Palestinian author and writer. This is Mideast Realities, and do get FAWAZ Turki's book, Exiles Return. It's available at your local bookstores. And thank you for tuning in to Mideast Realities.